So, still morning, good morning. At the bench today, not doing anything special. I'm actually trying to get a head start on a custom order as much as I can finish up today. If I can get everything done that I want to get done today, I'll be able to have it ready for Saturday, which would have been amazing. So, but I did want to turn on the cameras because as I'm tying away here, and what I'm doing is I'm adding stinger hooks to a couple different sizes of the Barumba heads, and this is for a store, custom orders for a store. They wanted 20 dozen. I actually had 9 or 10 dozen already in my boxes, which was a big help for me, but I still have another 10 dozen or so, 10 or 11 dozen to do. So I've already added stingers to 3 dozen, and I have to do another 6 dozen, adding stingers to 6 dozen. But I did want to turn on the camera, and unfortunately I can't show you this jig because I just don't have the time. But let me switch over. This is the second time that I'm actually recording this. The first time, for whatever reason, I had that that intro in the or the please stand by that I have on my machine. The music for that was just playing along in the background through 2/3 of the video. And what we did that day, I'm not sure how well you can see this. This is an awfully pretty jig. I ended up tying 6 of them just for me. Customer wanted these brown flatheads with a root beer colored or a fawn colored top color. That center color is that cream, and then a white belly with a gold polar flash as the tinsel. Now that gold polar flash is kind of a mix of gold and a pearl. But I'll try to add some picture or two of those at the end of the video. And I would love to still be tying a few of those. It was a fun little jig to tie. I think it would look good with maybe some stripes, kind of a sandpike or a perch, and I'm sure it will work fantastic. Those heads were 1/2 flat. I was going to do a couple maybe in 1/4 or 3/8. I think would work perfect. So maybe even some ball heads, 1/4 or 1/8. Right now we're at a really hot part of the summer. Not exactly sure when the video will air. There's a few in the queue before this. This one will air, but right now we're in the middle of a heat wave here in New York State. The rivers, it's been at least a full week since we've had rain. The rivers are nice and low. So maybe a couple lighter jigs, like I said, 1/8 or 1/4. But what I'm doing is very basic. I'm adding stinger hooks to these Barumba heads. I start with my size A rod wrapping thread. You can use any color thread. I just happen to use orange because I have an excess amount in my inventory. I have already pre-snelled these number 6 hooks, and I hang them on my rack just so I have them ready to go. You can put that fishing line right underneath your last wrap, and like I've shown before on my vise, I have markings, and I'm just lining the point of the hook up with the front edge of that last dot, so I know that they will all be the same length. And then with touching wraps, I can walk the thread towards the bend of the hook to lock it on. Now I'm adding a fair amount of pressure as I'm wrapping, as much as I dare to, but every so often you could stop and pull straight up, which really, it multiplies that force of, I don't know, the last few wraps that are on there. And then I just trim off this tail and then wrap up to the head. I'm a little bit sloppy here. These are kind of open wraps, but I know that I'm going to wrap back over and the threads will crisscross. So I go about halfway, about to the hook point, a little bit before, and I can stop. And then just like we're finishing a bucktail jig, I can take a size A thread of a different color, create a loop, and with about 5 wraps towards the head of the jig, I can just whip finish this. Now I don't really have to add an awful lot of wraps here, because after I've finished all the dozens that I'm doing, the 8 dozen that I'm tying, I'm going to go in with a thin down mixture of head cement. So usually it's about 10 to 1 ish to thin down the lacquer for the head cement. I might add a drop or 2 more, just so you know I don't need that candy shell on this thread, but I want it to saturate these threads, both layers, and then dry fairly quickly. So a little bit extra thinner in that lacquer, and you know it'll be dry in 20 minutes or less. But the main reason why I wanted to turn the cameras on, and like I said, this is the second time I'm recording this. The last time when I was doing that 3-color brown jig with the tinsel, I finally spent a fair amount of time thinking about the best answer of why use the type of thread that I use, the size thread that I use, why I prefer round thread versus flat thread, you know, why size A, why 2/0, right? So I spent a week or two, just, you know, an hour here, an hour there, and actually kind of wrote out my thoughts. And you can see the full, I don't know, the exercise. You can see the full paper on my website, jworthhandtied.com. In the blog section, you'll find my thoughts on thread, and I go into a little bit of detail. My explanation, of course, and we've talked about some of these things over the last year or two. Information on fly tires and how it translates into what we're doing with jigs. I've talked about some of the history of, you know, how I learned things, not just, you know, being passed down from tire to tire, my father being my main teacher. But there were other tires over the years that this is almost live, guys, so I won't cut out the mistake. But this spool is getting down towards the end, like the very end. So when the thread is up close to one side or the other, and I go to pull up, I think what I'm doing is pulling it on the edge of the bobbin. It's hitting it somehow. It's doing something weird, or just that the angle isn't pulling it straight off the bobbin, so it's a little bit more force. That's the third one that I've snapped like that. So as you can see, this bobbin's fairly loose. You know, I can pull the thread, no problem. But we'll do that. We can save that hook. That's no problem. So I did sit down, try to put some of the thoughts in order, there's a little bit of history, I suppose, in there. Though really it's, you know, it's my history, I guess, just as much as it's ancient history. You know, the ways that I learned, the things that I learned, but then as I gained more knowledge, particularly with fly tying. I didn't really start tying flies until my mid-20s. And then it's only been the last 15 years or so that I've really spent a lot of time really trying to learn aspects of fly tying, and as I'm doing that, I'm seeing how it relates to what I've already known, right? So I've had a few questions over the years. Why do I use the type of thread that I use? Why do I always say unwaxed? Why don't I use waxed thread? Why don't I put lacquer or Sally Hansen's on my hook shank? You know, there's been a few questions like that over the years with the videos. And in all honesty, I can't say that I've never waxed thread. And we're talking specifically about jig tying. Of course, I use waxed thread, I use flat thread, I use different diameter threads for fly tying. But for jigs, you know, I can't say that I've never done it, but I don't typically do it, and I don't, when I'm offering suggestions or instruction on how to tie jigs, I say you do not need to wax your thread to lock it onto the hook shank. You don't need to use Sally Hansen's or head cement to lock your thread onto the hook shank. There's absolutely no reason for it. Now, if you're using flat thread, yes, because flat thread will slide on a hook shank. But I advocate, teach, you know, my thread of choice is round, unwaxed nylon. Rod wrapping thread is really the only thread type that you'll find the size A now. You don't usually find it as a tying thread for flies or jigs. The 2/0 is very difficult to find, and I had that video recently where I discovered a company, Textream. Recently, they've been around a while. I just happened to be just recently learned of them, and their thread is a decent alternative. And I tied, where's my clipboard? Now I've tied roughly just about 100 dozen, either 1/4 or 1/8 jigs, right? That's the combination of both. But about 100 dozen, maybe a little bit more, using just the Techstream 3/0 standard thread, and it did the job. It is a little bit more delicate than the typical 2/0 thread that I would prefer to get if I can find it. There's also the Techstream Twisted, even though it's a 6/0, was about the same as the 3/0. I really liked using the twisted thread. Still waiting for Techstream to make more of the red 6/0 twisted so I could place an order. But you know, thin round nylon thread 2/0, it's getting a little hard to find. So in thinking about jig tying and what type of thread to use, to keep it very simple, basically thicker thread for larger size jigs. My cutoff is about 1/4, so 1/4 or larger. I like to use a size A thread because size A is the smallest diameter of the thick thread. And for jigs 1/4 or smaller, use a thinner thread. Thicker thread for bigger jigs, thinner thread for smaller jigs. The 2/0 I prefer, as it's the largest of the thin threads. So you can add a little bit more pressure on a 2/0 thread than you could a 3, 4, 5, or 3, 4, 6, 8/0 thread. But it's still thinner, so it does the job. Now, what is the job that we want it to do? We want it to be strong to hold the hair or feathers onto our hook. But we also want it to be sized in a way for economy of movement. So size A thread is thick enough where I can build a jig collar with not the, oh, I'm doing two different size jigs here. Hold on, I'm messing up. Just noticed I took these from the wrong pile. This one's a small one. So economy of movement, you want to make a collar that's proportioned, that has a nice look to it aesthetically, as well as you want the thread to hold the material, but you want your collar, when you're finished with it, to be nice, pleasing to look at. You don't want it to be so long. Like I like a nice slim collar. Slim meaning the distance from the head of the jig towards the bend of the hook, so how wide that is. You also want it to build up nicely, a nice cone shape proportion, etc. So talking about larger jigs, so size A thread, allows you to do that. Build your collar. The aesthetics of it look like it. Everything's in proportion. And you're able to do it with the least amount of wraps. So if I had a flat, thinner flat thread and you're wrapping your collar, you're wrapping to make it the same size as a size A thread collar, you're using an awful lot of material. And if you're doing thousands of jigs, that gets a little expensive, for one. It wears you out, I guess, for two. Not that I tie jigs in a way where it, 3 wraps to the left, 2 wraps to the right, add your material, 6 wraps, and then you're done. Like, it's not things aren't identified that precisely in tying, because there's, we're using natural materials, so sometimes you need an extra wrap or two. But with a flat thread, you're wrapping an awful lot more, crisscrossing again and again and again to get the same size collar. What the heck am I doing? So that's a consideration in terms of cost, not just cash, money cost, but also your time, the cost of time it takes to wrap, the 15 or 20 wraps versus 30 or 40 wraps, depending on, the thread you pick. You do want to break it down so the steps are the same, just like with fly tying, that the steps are the same, and using a standard type thread from jig to jig keeps those steps similar enough. And like I said, you're not going to be able to break it down specifically to 5 wraps to the left, 5 wraps to the right, left foot in, left foot out, that type of thing. It's not going to be that precise, but you are doing the same movements, roughly the same number of movements each time. You have that muscle memory that kicks in. You got, it's the way we make each jig the same over and over and over again, right? I think I'm getting to a point. Bear with me if I'm getting too far one side or the other. But like I said, it's much clearer on the website. You can go ahead and read that. But so the other aspects that I take into consideration why I prefer round thread versus flat thread. And as we're locking thread on, it's one of the easiest things to see. And like I said, I don't slop Sally Hansen's on there or super glue or lacquer. It's not necessary. I have a plain unwaxed round thread and I can lock it on, and this isn't going to slide. If I really yank on this, it'll pull it, but it's still going to stay tight. It's not going to unravel. Flat thread, on the other hand, has less, it spreads its surface out, so it has less force holding it in place. I guess you can explain it that way. And that's why, guys that are using flat threads have to put wax or use a Sally Hansen's or something like that on your hook shank. And I'm not picking on jig tires with this. This goes back 100 years with fly tying. Guys that would make shoemaker's wax is probably the easy over-the-counter wax. But you had guys taking beeswax and rosin and I don't know, castor oil, kind of making a recipe on the stove to make a fly tying wax. Walt Deddy had I've only seen it called the thread waxing box. That's what it was described as. I'm assuming it was basically a tin can that had a candle or some sort of heat source that would melt the wax, and you had a spool on one end and a spool on the other, and you could run your thread through the melted wax and onto a new spool, and once that cooled, you could take your spool and use it for fly tying. Slaymaker, he's a author we've talked about before in fly tying. He talks about actually taking the spool, and I don't think he dunks it in he probably took a brush and brushed the melted wax onto the spool of thread, but it was thin enough and warm enough to saturate the entire spool of thread. Bergman, he was a field and stream writer. He's got all sorts of books out on fishing. I just read recently too, he was a hell of a fly tyer, even though he's not considered a fly tyer, I guess. It's probably because he worked mostly as a writer. And I think it was field and stream was where he worked. But in one of his books I just recently discovered also, he has a picture of a can basically sitting on a stove with melted wax. Just a pen drawing. So where are we going with this? So locking the thread on, why I like round thread. If I tie a collar and then cut it into a cross section, it would look an awful lot like when you pile logs. You're a logger, you cut down 30 logs or so and you pile them kind of in a pyramid shape. And if you look at a cross section of that pile, how the logs, you have two side by side, but that creates a little valley that the log that goes on the next layer kind of fits in, right? So your round nylon thread acts similarly. So when I tie this on, and I'm doing touching wraps right now, there's no space, but if you added if you looked real close at this microscope, used a microscope, look nice and close at this, you would see, peaks and valleys between the wraps of thread. As I go back, and now I'm doing open wraps on this half, just because I know when I reverse wrap, I'm going to wrap it back through, and the thread's going to fill in even the wide gaps. On this section here, the threads sit on top of each other, but they can't slide because it's two layers that slightly overlap each other. So that's why I use round thread. Now this concept, or this aspect of the thread, how it interlocks that way, also plays a role in when you're wrapping a collar and adding more than just two layers. And it also comes into play when you're tying a knot, because you're crisscrossing threads and overlapping, and as you tie a knot, and again the threads are overlapping in a way so they can't twist out of place, they can't what's a knot? That's just a typical fisherman's knot. You make a loop, you make a loop through your hook eye, and then you 7 or 8 rotations around your line. Put your tag end back through the loop and around, and pull it tight, and it cinches all those spiral wraps together. So now the thread can't, or your fishing line can't unravel. And it's, that's the interlocking aspects of that is why the knot doesn't come undone, and why, another reason why I would prefer round thread over flat. Not to pick on any specific jig tires, but when you do watch guys tying jigs, as soon as they add 3 or 4 rotations, you never see them untwist their flat tying thread. So after just a few rotations, they're tying with a twisted cord anyways, which is round. I can't think of anybody off the top of my head that I've ever seen tying jigs with flat thread, whereas they're wrapping, they stop and then rotate their bobbin so it untwists, so it'll be flat again. So in that sense, in that regard, I think what we're witnessing is somebody that's using a technique or material that they learned about probably from a fly tire, right? Use flat thread, or the guy at the fly shop who just wants to sell you thread. And when you tell them you're looking for round jig tying thread, they don't have round thread, but he'll make up a reason why you take the flat thread. But they don't understand fully the material that they're using. But watch some fly tires that are using flat thread, that are tying streamers, or some of the larger flies that require more wraps kind of in a row like we're doing here. And they'll talk about, as you're wrapping, to stop, twist your bobbin counterclockwise, let it spin counterclockwise to undo those wraps, to undo that twisting, so your thread will again lay flat. But in a nutshell, I think that's it for the thread. If I made absolutely no sense in the last, it's been about 15 minutes or so, if I've made absolutely no sense, the main thing to take away from this is you use round nylon, a thicker thread for bigger head jigs, a thinner thread for smaller head jigs. That's what it comes down to. But like I said, you could go to the website jworthhandtied.com, take a look at my thoughts on thread, and I hope it answers some questions. I don't consider myself an expert. I know that I've been tying for quite some time, but I always try to not completely discount even the guys that I picked on, the examples that I picked on just now, using Sally Hansen's on your hook shank before you put your thread on. I don't completely discount that, because there is something to be learned from that. If you can answer the why you did that, if there's a good reason for it, then that's okay. And like I said, I can't say that I've never done that. I can't say that I've never waxed my thread, even my round thread. So, there might be a reason when I sit down and tie a jig that I might break some of those rules because no rule is completely hard and fast, especially what we're doing here. So, as jig tiers, we're using skills. We're copying fly tires. We're not innovative. I can't think of pretty much anything that we're actually innovative in regard to jig tying when there was 75, almost 100 years of fly tying before. Even longer if you go to Scotland and England, right? So there was hundreds of years of fly tying before, some guy on the East Coast wanted to put lead on his fly, on his streamer. I do use the term founding fathers when I'm talking about fly tying. That I'm not trying to discount the founding women of fly tying either. Carrie Stevens and Helen Shaw. Two super talented ladies. I've seen some Carrie Stevens streamers in person. They're absolutely beautiful. And I'm not a big fan necessarily of tying that kind of streamer. I do like hair wings. I do like bucktails. But some of those streamers are just outstanding. But those are people that learned what we're doing and passed along the information, and we can only do our best to follow through with what we're taught. Try to remember the how and why of what we're taught. And as tyers, and I'm kind of interested in this, and I've talked about this before, is it's super interesting to me when a young tyer versus an old tyer, an East Coast tyer versus somebody from out west. Even, I'm here in New York State. You go farther north, up into Maine, and you talk about techniques or materials, or you see how somebody else is using the material. I've listened to people talk about something like it was the newest thing, like they invented it, and it was something that I was taught as a kid. I've done things thinking that I was, learning some secret knowledge on how to, something as simple as tying a knot, and then you meet somebody from, out west who's been doing it for decades, right? So it's interesting to me, those type of things. You see that a lot with flies, naming flies. I've criticized Herder and the way he writes. If you read through some of his books, he makes it sound like he invented specific flies. I think Herder, best case, I think he plays with words. It's twice that I've done that. Where he takes a fly, let's say a Hendrickson. He most certainly did not invent the Hendrickson. But he'll list his pattern and maybe use a different color thread. I'm just guessing. But using that as an example. Using a different color thread and then saying that he invented that pattern, right? So, is he wrong technically? No. Good. Your Hendrickson uses black thread, and the Hendrickson that's been tied for 100 years uses tan. So, you have to take, I can't remember my exact reason why I was throwing shade on Herder. But basically, you take things with a grain of salt, right? Herder had a ton of knowledge, right? His books, however many books he published, how many editions, 20 some odd editions. He was a very successful businessman. Can't take that away from him. He might have been a hell of a fisherman, I don't know. But he just happened to be the loudest pig in the trough, right? So you kind of have to take some of that with a grain of salt. And I try not to be too pushy. Like I've always said, there's no secrets. I'll answer any question somebody asks with tying. I'll show you. I show the not glamorous stuff, sitting here for another, I don't know, I'll be here at least another 2 hours doing this exact same thing. It's when it comes to tying, you don't always get to tie the 3-color jig with stripes and the feathers from an exotic bird, and no, sometimes you're just lashing on some bucktail and calling it a day. But I don't mind showing that. So there's no secrets. I'm not trying to make it look like I'm something that I'm not, right? Because when it comes down to it, this is it. All right, you're not going to get rich tying jigs. You'll make some decent money. You make enough money to pay for the gas for your boat, right? You might get guys that tell you how much they appreciate your work. You might even, make a few bucks to make it worth your time. But when it comes down to it, it's a lifestyle. And that was another thing that I read when I was reading about Walt Deddy. In one of his in his book, I don't remember what it's called, but he was being very honest as well. He's famous for raising chickens for their feathers. He spent decades pairing up chickens with rooster so he could get feathers of a specific quality, of a specific color, a natural done chicken feather, right? So he's pretty famous. He was known all over the world, right, for that. As a fly tyer, Walt and Winnie Deddy, freaking amazing. His flies were awesome, right? He was a good instructor. He was a good student of tying, even teaching himself how to tie by taking apart flies of other more famous fly tyers from the time. But he described very similar. I'm paraphrasing, but basically it's a lifestyle. You don't get rich from it. You have good times and you have bad times. But when it comes down to it, it's a craft that we would do whether we're getting paid for it or not. And I've explained it this way. I would sit here and tie whether we even had the internet or not, right? So, Deddy is an example. He always had other jobs. He always, you work full time and you do this part time. It's a seasonal job. It's a seasonal job that keeps you busy all year long. So kind of took a weird spin on that, didn't it? But let me just switch over. So like I said, I have 4 dozen more of these to do. Basically it's the same thing. I'm just adding stinger hooks. Like I said, I will go through with thin down head cement, and I'll hit those hook shanks on both sides, and then once they're dry I can add some hair to them to get this order squared away. I hope the talk on thread makes sense. I find it very difficult to explain, and you would think that it's not. But without it like a whiteboard and drawing pictures and showing how the logs stack together, it just seems odd in my head, and I should be able to describe it better. So I've nailed it down to, like I said, larger jigs, thicker thread, smaller jigs, thinner thread, round nylon, unwaxed. That's all you need. But use the thread that you're comfortable with. Try new things when you can, and keep an open mind, right? We can learn a little bit something from other tires. Everybody we see, whether they're novice or long-time tires, you can always learn a little something. But I think that's going to do it for us today. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any other questions like the thread thing, put those down below. I will, if it's something that I think we need to dive into, then, I'll write another chapter, I guess is what I'm calling it, and put it on the website. But to really maybe get a clearer idea of what the hell I'm talking about, go to the website jworthhandtie.com for my thoughts on thread. But like I said, I think that's going to do it for us today. As always, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any new content. Feel free to share any of our videos, as it does help increase awareness for the channel. Check out the website. Check out my thoughts on thread. But until next time, guys, keep tying and tight lines.